Have I got a microphone in my face? Can you see me? It's okay. You can see that. I'm going to have to move it because it's actually blocking my view of the screen. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Okay. Welcome. I am Rebecca O'Rourke, and it's a name that a lot of English people struggle to spell and pronounce, so no problems with that. And my colleague Helen, I'm going to talk, and then we will both answer questions that you may have. And what I'm aiming to cover is to understand the pressure to publish, to outline publishing pitfalls and the additional pressures for non-native speakers of English. My thesis is that there are pitfalls and problems with publishing, and brackets, some of them are different and additional for non-native speakers of English, but they are the same a lot of the time. And I'm going to outline some strategies that can be adopted to avoid or minimise these pitfalls. I want to begin with a little more about us. We've already had our introduction. Maybe it's helpful to know from my point of view that my lifelong passion has been writing and encouraging and supporting the writing of others, to demystify the kind of ideas we have about writing, that it is something natural, that it is difficult, that some people do it, that you can't learn it, you can't teach it. I've spent my life challenging those ideas and supporting everybody to become better writers than they think they are or could be. And those people range from people who do not have basic literacy through to people who are returning to study in later life, having missed out on their schooling for various reasons, through to, and I won't name them here, but I have a couple of professors on my books who struggle with writing and research writing and publishing, who I also work with and support. But the main bulk of my work at the moment is to support our new and early career research group at Leeds. That includes our postgraduate research students. Helen, would you like to say a little bit about yourself?
Oh, okay.
Your kind of writing things?
Okay, so my name's Helen Bradbury, and I'm a pharmacist by background. Spent 19 years working in St James's Hospital in Leeds as a practicing pharmacist, hospital pharmacist, and became much more involved with teaching through that role. And I moved to the university 19 years ago, and I've now been doing this second career of mine for 19 years. So 19 seems to be a theme. I mainly have a teaching role, so my role is mainly in teaching, but I've dabbled in writing, and I also need Rebecca's support with that writing. And so what I have done is I mainly do supervision of students when they're doing their research, and my writing is helping them, support them to publish that research. And so I sort of tag on the end of their papers. But I've also been involved with 2 books that we've edited, and I've supported people to do chapters within those books. One is about reflective practice, and the other one is about prescribing. So they're my 2 roles, education and then pharmacy and prescribing. So
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Helen. And there's something about you, as an adult educator, my instinct is to go around the room and ask everybody's name and why they're here and what they do. But I know this is not practice at a plenary. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to just take a moment or so to reflect on, maybe write down an answer to the question, why do you publish scholarship and research, or why do you want to publish scholarship and research if you're not currently doing it? So I'll give you a minute to think about that and maybe make a note of it. And there will be a couple of other points where I'll be asking you to think and make a note if you have something with you to write with. I won't be collecting them in to mark at the end, don't worry. You can do it in your head if you wish to. Okay, so moving on, I'm now going to give you a list of reasons why people publish. They do it because they want to exchange and develop knowledge. They do it because they want to influence others and improve the practice in their field. So they're wanting impact that is about what we do rather than what we know. They want to challenge existing ideas and theories that might be within knowledge, might be critiquing and moving on a field through its shaping concepts and theories, or it might be moving on practice or patient care through things that we do differently. It may be because you want to gain esteem or status for yourself and or IMU. That may be where some of the pressures come from. And it may be to advance your career in what is increasingly a performance-driven university system. When I first went to university as a student, it was very unusual for my lecturers to engage in research and publishing. They were mostly researching, but they published occasionally. A publication was a big event. When I first became an academic myself, a publication was a big event, and we mostly published books, and we worked our way up to that by publishing chapters in books or being involved in editing collections, and then we got our own books, and it was a very exciting moment. Today, a book is hardly ever opened and read, and unless it's on an online screen, and it's not the primary goal of an academic or a scholar to publish a book, partly because the performance-driven system requires a number of outputs in a fixed period of time, which have a time-stamp validity on them. And so there is a pressure to publish articles and to get those articles turned around as fast as possible. In education, that notion of things going out of date is a rather incongruent idea to us, because some of the basic fundamentals of educational philosophy in a Western or European context go back a very long way. I can still see Socrates in my approach to teaching and learning. I suspect on this side of the world, some of you can see Confucius in your approaches to teaching and learning, and other philosophers who are centuries old. I noticed that the oaths that line the walls here were not within the last 3 to 5 years, so they wouldn't be current in some of the performance indicator schemes we're all working under. But we are in what we're in. It's a performance-driven university system, so it is expected or required of you. That's why you do it. You may want to publish because you've got too much spare time in your current role. Is there anybody who'd like to put their hand up for that one? No, I didn't think so. Okay. Did you have anything that isn't on my list? Would you put your hand up if you had anything that's not on my list? Yes? Were you putting your hand up or just waving in a friendly fashion? No. Okay. I think that pretty much covers it. So we know why people do it. We know what the pressures are. Let's now move on to the context in which we're doing it. This quotation comes from a journal, Advances in Health Sciences Education, and it's 4 years old, so in some contexts I shouldn't be using it. But I suspect it is still current, and the numbers may change a little bit. The numbers it may be 11% rather than 13% now. But the editor is basically saying that we accept a very, very small proportion of the papers that are submitted to us. And of those that are rejected, sometimes people go and try to publish elsewhere, sometimes because their rejection letter has said, this is a really excellent article, but it doesn't meet the guidelines and criteria for our journal. You'd be better publishing it in X. And that is certainly a letter I've written several times in my capacity as either a peer reviewer or an associate editor or editor of journals. So it's quite legitimate to go and publish elsewhere. But Norman is saying about 1 in 3 get published elsewhere. So there's still an awful lot that don't get published. And I think he's absolutely right to say that in the bigger, higher impact journals, the acceptance rate is going to be even lower. And then he says something really important. It's not a conspiracy. People often think there is a conspiracy. Oh, they just publish the people they know. They just publish the big names. They have a quota system for small unfunded project papers. They have a quota system for international authors, for non-native authors. He's saying, no, it's not a conspiracy, it's not a quota system. We accept 13% because 13% are acceptable. We can accept them. Now, what I want you to reflect on is what you think that 87% of those journal authors are getting wrong. What is it they're not doing, or what is it that they don't know? I give you a minute to do that, a minute and a half to do that. Okay. It could be a very long list, so you might need half an hour to write it down rather than 90 seconds. But what they're doing is they are falling into the traps. They are coming across the pitfalls and coming off worse in the battle with them. So what I'm going to do now is take you through my list, my understanding of what those pitfalls are. And they are pitfalls that come from my evidence base for them is the mistakes I've made over the years, and there have been plenty. It's coming from my experience as a peer reviewer and an editor on journals, and my work in supporting people with their writing and publishing, and my own academic training, which has been in applied linguistics and writing development. So the first pitfall is that you do the research and then you think about writing it up and then you think about publishing from it. So you separate those things out. Whereas I would argue that research is writing and writing is research. One of the things that's distinctive about research is that you formulate your ideas, you weigh your evidence, you work out what you think and what is relevant to what you think by writing about it, and by writing about it in a structured, logical way, making a case for it. And that is a particular issue, I think, for students, master's students doing their dissertations, and particularly PhD students or EdD students doing their dissertations. They kind of want to do the research and then write it up. Now that has changed. When I first registered for a PhD, we had lifetime completion, and there were some people who took the lifetime to complete and still failed to do it because they would do the research and then they were going to write it up, and somehow the writing up never happened and never happened and never happened. And we see that less in the formal research doctorates now and the research dissertations, because we know it's a pitfall and we are encouraging and requiring writing all the way through that process. But we do see it in small grant and sometimes larger grant projects where people are very focused and organised about doing the research and doing the project and managing the project, and the reporting on interim findings and progress is a PowerPoint slide with a list of bullet points. And it kind of works, but it doesn't make it very easy when you're coming to publish an edited collection or a journal article from that research. It can still get put off, separated off. So you need to be aware of that. And that applies across the board. That is not specific to anybody other than people doing research and not writing it up promptly. The other pitfall, which the academic workplace and the pressures of the academic workplace and the pressures of academic performance, I think, do encourage, is that you focus too much on conference presentations. So I had a habit of thinking, I'll write the abstract, I'll submit for the conference. If I get accepted, I will write the paper, and then I will do a draft of the paper, then I will go and give my paper, I'll think about the comments and the feedback, I'll revise my draft, and then I will submit it. Did I do that? No, I didn't. Other things came into play, and I was on to the next conference or on to the next thing. But if you can retrain yourself and write the abstract, get accepted, write the draft, it is a lot easier. You can even there is a method which is outlined by Rowena Murray and by Pat Thompson, who are on the reference list that you'll get at the end of this, and they give you a really easy step-by-step guide to using your conference abstract as a template for writing the first draft of your paper. So that's one of your pitfalls and also one of the solutions. You might be trying to turn a thesis, a long thesis, 20, 50, 60, 80,000 words, or a substantial research project report for a project that lasted for 3 years and had 17 partners in it, into a journal paper or a book chapter just by reducing it. A little bit like me trying to get into Helen's clothes. I would just be trying to squeeze things in and it wouldn't fit. You have to reconfigure and rewrite and write for purpose to make it work. The other pitfalls are you start but you don't finish. I think we've all been there, got form with that one. And then the worst, in my opinion, and I have done this, is you finish the paper, but you never quite get around to submitting it. And if you had written it and finished it for a special issue call for papers, that was a really stupid thing to do. But you think, oh, the moment's gone, or the moment has gone, other things happen in your life. The other pitfall on this slide, there are more, is that you're working without a publishing plan. You're running around in a flap. In our culture, we would talk about it as your headless chicken mode. You're just, right, publish, submit, da, 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 da. What does it all add up to? What's the logic of it? What's the plan? If you don't have a plan, you're in a very dangerous place. So I will be advising that you plan both the minutiae of how you write this paper, but also how this paper you're writing now links to what you want to be doing in a year's time, 3 years' time, 5 years' time, and beyond. So you need a plan. If you look at the work of the people you like to read and you respect, they are often working the same ground. They're not rewriting the same paper, but they are building on and developing their own understanding of the things that matter to them. And it might be quite specialised. You don't get very many pick and mix successful established research writers published. So be careful if that is your disposition. If you're like, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting, we could write about that, we could write about that, we could write about that, you may come unstuck. So in the pitfalls, I'm kind of taking you from global to specific. So if we think about the pitfalls when you are actually there with your plan and you are starting to write your paper, you will inevitably, when you're in the early and sometimes even the middle stages of your career, be underestimating how hard it is, how much work it is, how much time it's going to take, and you will not be accepting that the process is submit, revise, and resubmit. If I was being really, really honest, it would be submit, reject, submit, reject, submit, reject, submit, revise. There is always a point in a new early career researcher's life where I have to sit them down and explain that the 3-page letter with suggestions for improvements is fantastic. It is progress. They see it as failure. I failed to get accepted at my first attempt with this paper. Actually getting feedback of any kind that is other than, thank you, not suitable for our journal, is progress. And you have to learn to see it as a learning opportunity and inevitable. So it takes time. Mary Jane Curry and Teresa Lillis, who have written articles and published a book, which I think will be of interest to people in this room, which is about the specific challenges of the globalization of English as the language for academic work, who have some very practical strategies backed up by a lot of very interesting research on writing and publishing practices for non-native speakers of English. They produce some case studies that detail the work, how many times it was redrafted before it got to be submitted, how many times it was revised, how long that process took. And we are basically talking months and years, not weeks and months. So it's worth bearing that in mind. It's also worth bearing in mind that the more experienced you become by doing more of it, the better you get at it. So you have to resist that temptation to wait until you can do it perfectly before you do it at all. It doesn't work. It's like crossing the road or learning to drive. You cannot learn to drive by standing, watching the cars go by. I would say especially in Malaysia. You have to get behind the wheel and take your chances and do it. So knowing what you're dealing with is really important. Then we come on to the paper. I would say probably the biggest issue we spend time, Helen and I spend time talking to our students who are publishing from the masters, and I spend with students who are publishing from their doctoral research, is they lack clarity about the main focus of that paper. One journal article cannot do everything. It cannot sum up everything. It's almost as if they think, well, I might just get one paper published, so I'd better put everything in it because I might not get another one published. You have to be really, really clear and focused about what it's saying and to whom it is saying it. Who is your target audience? If you just want the world to read it, the world won't read it. The world of medical education won't read it. It will be of specific interest to specific people who share your interest in a theory, a methodology, a practice area, a practice problem. And you have to be very clear about that. And you increasingly need to be clear about the impact. In other words, what's the benefit to your chosen audience of reading your paper? What's the benefit to the journal of publishing your paper? So you have to think about impact. The next pitfall when you've got your paper and you're about to submit it, when you're writing it, is to ignore some or all of the guidelines and advice to authors. One of the big changes I've seen in the world of academic publishing is the detail that journals go to now to specify what it is they are interested in. There are now several 100,000 journals. They all have to have their unique selling point, their little bit of that market. They're not generalists. They're not, if it's written in sentences, we'll have it. They are very particular. So do not waste your time writing something within a research paradigm that is not appropriate, well, write it, don't submit it to a journal that is not going to be remotely interested in your critical realist paradigm or your positivist paradigm. You know, you're not going to change their minds with your paper. If they've written advice and guidelines to you about the types of papers they submit and the word lengths and the expectations for those papers, follow them. Some people have very big egos, but it's me, and I need 6,000 words. Well, I'm sorry, sitting on the other side of that exchange, if it comes into me and it's 6,000 words, I'm probably going to just send it straight back saying, this is not within our range, you know, resubmit it when you've got it to 3,000 words. And you need to do that. They're there to help you, so take that help. The other kind of ego, which is sometimes ego, well, I don't need it, and is sometimes a real anxiety, lack of confidence, imposter syndrome issue, is you don't get your draft read by anybody before you send it off. You don't want to show up yourself in front of your colleagues or your seniors. So you send it off and see what happens, because deep down you feel it's not going to be good enough, and it's okay for this anonymous journal editor or peer reviewer to tell you it wasn't good enough. You don't want your supervisor, especially if your supervisor is a senior member of staff, which they often are, to know that. So you don't get an outsider's view on it. That is really critical, to get outside views, not least because even if it's a very good piece of work, you are so inside it, you don't know what you need to say to somebody who isn't so inside it for them to make sense of it and understand the value of what it is you're writing. And you also need somebody who can read it and understand what it is you're saying. When I'm asking our new and early career people to read and comment on each other's work, the first thing I get them to do is to write a paragraph that says what the paper is about and what it's arguing, and then they say that back to the author. And sometimes the author says, "Oh, you've missed the point completely," to the reader. But actually, it's the author who has not communicated their point clearly enough. If the reader can miss the point and not get what was important about this paper, that is not the reader's responsibility. Entirely, it is also the author's. And the other pitfall here is you submit without proofreading and editing. We're back to pressure. You're often doing this stuff fast. You're often doing it in scraps of time. You're often doing it to a deadline. So it's like, oh, I can't bear to look at it anymore, in it goes. If you haven't proofread and edited, and they are not the same thing, I'll talk about that later, you are on risky ground. And that's something that is, I think, particularly the case for the non-native speaker of English submitting to an English journal, because you need, if at all possible, to have a native English speaker read that through and say, we wouldn't say it like this, or this isn't quite the right word to use, or we do it differently. So you're at least giving yourself the chance to jump over that hurdle at that stage. Once you've written it, once you've had the drafts read and you've corrected them and you've proofread it, you have more pitfalls ahead of you. It's a dangerous game. It's dangerous territory. You might select the wrong journal, and there are many, many ways of selecting the wrong journal. It may be a journal you've heard about, but you've never read it. That's really risky. Something that you only read occasionally can be risky. It's not impossible. It can be a journal that rarely publishes the type of article you want to submit. Journals do have different purposes, they have different audiences, they have different mission statements, and you really do need to know what they are in order to target your journal effectively. Otherwise, you might as well stand on the street corner and hand out copies of your article randomly, because that in effect is what you're doing. One other area of wrongness that is a pitfall is you can be very narrow about the discipline or the practice area that you're in. So if you are in medical education, your sights will be firmly set on medical education journals. But actually, you have a richness of opportunity there. There are education journals that would be interested in a medical case study or a medical example of the thing you've researched and written about. There are journals of professional learning, work and learning, continuing education that will be interested in the medical case. So you will sometimes take your focus on the education, sometimes on the medical, sometimes on the medical education together. That gives you an advantage over a lot of other people, but you need to explore a little bit more widely than people sometimes do. And using the medical example there would apply across the health professions, so nursing or pharmacy or any of the other or any of the allied health professions, what you have to say may be of interest elsewhere. It may be that it's of interest in an interprofessional context. It may be of interest methodologically. There are an awful lot of journals that are purely devoted to advancing the methodologies, and they want lots of examples that come from different cases. So, you can think widely. The bigger pitfalls than selecting wrong journals is not really understanding how decisions to accept articles are made. There is a certain kind of naivety about that sometimes for people. One of the ways is you read what the journal says, but a better way to gain that understanding is to actually get involved in the process yourself. So apply to be a peer reviewer. If you get the opportunity to be a guest editor or an associate editor, take it up. Talk to more experienced people about it, because it can only be helpful to you. The other pitfall is to take rejection very hard and think, well, that's it. Publishing across the board, academic or any other kind of publishing, is a story of resilience and keeping going. One of the factors that distinguishes successful published authors in any genre and field from the unsuccessful is the successful ones kept going. You have to kind of resubmit it. You might have to rework it, but you resubmit it. But if you do resubmit, you address the feedback that's been received. If there were substantive things pointed out to you that on reflection you think that's a fair comment, do something about it before you send it on. And the other pitfall is about your workflow and about how you integrate research writing into your working life. It is always on the margins. Even if you're a full-time researcher, and I did that for many years as a professional researcher, somehow the emphasis was always on getting the next grant or doing that field work or talking to the stakeholders and the partners or managing the project finances, and it was not as central. No paid project I ever worked on had a Gantt chart that gave me 6 months to write and publish from the project. I did the writing and publishing in my own time after that project had finished, in smaller projects, and I had to fight to do it as we went along on the bigger ones. And it's similar for you. You have pressures of teaching, administration, family, everyday life. So you have to really work hard to bring publishing and writing into the mainstream of your life. It's what you do. You accept it, other people will accept it. And one way to do that is to try and make sure that as you've got one paper with a journal being considered, you have another one well on the way. And when you have one well on the way, you're starting to formulate your ideas for the next one. So you keep a flow going. How fast you can keep that flow going and how many will be in those different time slots will depend on your level of ambition, your actual workload, but you need to have the principle of not starting from the beginning every time you do this. That is really important for you. Does anybody have a pitfall which I haven't covered on my list? Do you want to put your hand up if you have? No. I've kind of covered them, I think, haven't I? I think I've covered them. But you might be thinking, I thought this was about the common pitfalls for the non-native speaker of English. What about us? What about that? And what I would say about that is these pitfalls are the pitfalls. They apply to you and they apply to the native speakers as well. So I'm going to talk about these pitfalls, and then I am going to talk about the specific pitfalls for the non-native speaker. And I'm doing it that way not because I'm rude or intending to be rude or dismissive of the problems. I work with a lot of international students. I've received a lot of international submissions when I've worked as a peer reviewer and editor. I know it's a real issue, but it seems to me that one of the issues is that some international authors think, or some non-native speakers of English think, it's the only issue. The only issue for them is the language. If only they could crack the syntax of English, if only they could get, that insight into what vocabulary and synonyms are and aren't acceptable, they'd be sorted. And it's not the case. You have to get everything else right, because the language, the surface language, can be sorted very easily. If you haven't formulated your argument and your claim and the evidence that supports your claim and described coherently to us why this matters, it doesn't matter whether it was grammatically correct or not. It's the argument that counts. It's what you have to say that counts. How you say it also counts, but it's knowing your way around the purpose of the journal article and the world of academic publishing that really counts, and then the language stuff comes in as a supplementary. So I think these pitfalls and the strategies to minimise or avoid them, we can cluster them into different themes. Some of them an individual can deal with and develop and overcome on their own. Some of them will require an institutional response. Some of it you cannot overcome on your own, and I think that is one of the pressures, that you can't do everything yourself. Understanding the writing process and how to stay motivated is really important. Writing generates a kind of fear amongst people. People have anxieties about it. One of the most anxious and undermined people where writing is concerned is one of the professors I talked about earlier. And yes, they have succeeded and they've gone far, but they've always done it with something in the pit of their stomach and a little voice in their ear saying, really? You think you're good enough? You think you're good enough? So it's important to understand how writing happens and find a way of making writing happen that works for you and keep motivated. It's important to understand the article as a text type, i.e. what does it look like, but also what John Swales talks about as what are the moves, what is the cognitive underpinning of the way this article is structured. So it's not just about having the right headings, it's about having done the right thinking and making your claim for the argument and making the logic of your argument clear to yourself and then communicating it clearly to others, so that you are making your claim and evidencing your claim in a way that the editors and peer reviewers of your targeted journal will understand. And that is very different for your scientific clinical end of the spectrum and your education social science end of the spectrum. And journals like medical education, which are somewhere in the middle, an academic teacher, a medical teacher, you have a little bit of chance about whether you get a peer reviewer who is at this end of the spectrum of your papers at that end, or vice versa. So you get a bit of mixing in the middle. You need to understand that peer review process, how it works. You need to plan, and you need to work on building capacity, motivation, and resilience, because those qualities are essential. It's hard, and it undermines you, and it never gets any easier to get rejected, and it also, I think, never gets that much easier to start afresh, to start a new project, to work out a new program for, how are we going to, what are our intended publishing outputs from this research project we're doing, or this pedagogic development we're instigating at work, because the pressure is always on, let's do the research, let's apply it to practice, let's do the pedagogic development and change our teaching. You have to really keep going and keep pushing to get the research writing and publishing up there. So, if I come to the non-native English speakers, academic writing, whether you're doing it in English or any other language, is nobody's mother tongue, and it is important to remember that. Everyone struggles. But there are real additional struggles for people writing in English whose mother tongue is not English. And some of those pressures are what I call the technical fluency, so the grammar, the vocabulary, the syntax, what are sometimes called surface details of language, which is a way of describing them that I think was coined by the English speakers, because it seems sometimes to dismiss the struggle that it is. If I had to give this talk in Malay or Mandarin or Bengali or Hindi or even French or Spanish or Gaelic, I would be struggling. I might manage hello in some of those languages. So I'm not underestimating the struggle it is. But it's only one part of it. Much more important is the cultural fluency, and that's the insight into the subtle ways that language gets used by a native speaker that is very hard for a non-native speaker to understand. So that's about, you use a word that at one level does mean what you think it means, but actually doesn't mean what you think it means. And English is a particularly troublesome language for that. We have endless ways of saying the same thing, but it isn't the same thing. There's a slight difference. And there's also insight into what I'm calling discourse or form. So finding the level of formality and informality in a written text for a particular journal is quite an art. It's hard for native speakers, but it's even harder for the non-native, because you don't pick up on those subtle markers in the language that are indicating this is a book review, this is a think piece by a very eminent person who is allowed to use certain ways of talking that would be unacceptable for a doctoral researcher in the early stages of their work, and so on. And the other pressure that happens, which I see a lot in my PGR students, is that there is what I call a dumbing down, that you write what you can write rather than what you actually want to say. And that is the most difficult one to challenge. And there are various strategies suggested for that. One is to write what you want to say in your mother tongue and then translate it yourself. If you do that, and there's some example, Teresa Lillis and Mary Jane Curry talk about this, where you use professional translation services or you use Google Translate, it won't work because it's general. It's not going to pick up the nuances of academic discourse. So the translation route can be difficult. I suggest to my PGRs that they do it in early stages of their work, and then they gradually move over to doing their first drafts in English. There's also the focus on the surface features of language at the expense of substantive content and argument. Having something to say, having a claim to make and the evidence to support that claim, and a very clear account of the coherence and rigour of the research process that produced those findings is what matters. You must put 80% of your energy into that, and then 20% into have I written it clearly, have I communicated it clearly. And the other factor which I have to say is a Eurocentric prejudice. It isn't easy to get published if you're a native speaker, but it is easier, I think. So there is extra effort, and I think one of the ways of challenging that is for more people to become peer reviewers, more people to be on the editorial boards, more people to be out in the world of publishing, because at the moment the gatekeepers are disproportionate in the English. English is global in academic publishing, but the gatekeepers are also the native English people. So the more people who get in, who have insight, who can read through the awkwardness of the grammatical constructions to see what somebody is actually saying and can see the validity and the relevance of what they're saying, the better. So I think that is one way to deal with that. And one of the other ways to deal with it is more partnership working and coaching and mentoring between native and non-native speakers. Teresa Lillis and Mary Jane Curry would also argue that non-native English speakers should not give up the fight, and that they should support and publish quality research in their mother tongue languages. That, if you buy into the assumption that it only counts if it's written in English, it only counts if it's published in English, you are not supporting the rich vernacular traditions of your own cultures. That's a debate. And it's one I kind of feel I can't have a view on. I think you should have the view on that. So, avoiding these, as I say, I've gone through some of those. One thing which some of you may know about. Does anybody know about the Academic Phrase Bank at Manchester University? Hands up if you do. No, right. This is a gift. If only one thing is of use and interest to you from this plenary, it is the Academic Phrase Bank developed at Manchester University. It was developed by English for Academic Purposes people. It's not just a list of words or phrases. It is case studies and examples of how you use them, why you're using them. It's a working guide to academic discourse. It's a fantastic resource, and it is freely available. You Google Academic Phrase Bank, Manchester University, and it comes to you. You used to have a small subscription to it, but it is now free to download and access. Other things on that list I've already talked about. Peer review criteria, this is how you know what's being looked for, but I am running out of time, so these slides can be made available to people and you can go through those criteria yourself, because what's more important is the moving forward with confidence. For the individual, you want to reconfigure your approach to writing time, process, inspiration, imitation, creativity, and Rowena Murray will help you do that. You need to build within your own networks and institutions a community of research writers, or you need to join an existing community of research writers. And there are some fantastic blogs out there that will enable you to do that, and I've listed some of them there. And I've listed some research resources on setting up writers' groups for you. And you need to have a strategy. You can't wait and hope that research writing and publishing will just happen. You can't wait for, that 8th day that nobody else yet knows about, or for your lovely Vice-Chancellor or Dean to give you an extra month in the year that you can do your research writing and publishing in. You have to make it, and you have to make it out of small steps and big goals. And you need some support in doing it. Those resources will give you some helpful things to do it. So there are things individuals can do and must do, because there are also things institutions can do, but the institution will want to see the individual making the effort, and then how they can come in and support that. They can't do it all for you. It's got to be an interplay. There's got to be collaboration between individual and institutional effort. So at an institutional level, which might be a faculty, a department, a university, you want to support individual writers by setting up your own pre-publication peer review group. And that might be reviewing the ideas. This is what I'm thinking of doing. This is what I'm planning to do. This is the draft of what I have done. And that will bring experienced researchers and writers into mentoring relationships with new and early career researchers and writers. And depending on the model, the organisational model, it need not be a huge burden on your experienced people. There are ways of streamlining that so you get the benefit and there is institutional advantage, because as papers go out into the wider world, editors and reviewers notice them. So they, if they start to think, oh, we've been getting quite a lot of good quality work from IMU, or we've been getting a lot of really poor work from IMU, you want notice for good, not notice for bad. And it just is that quality check before it goes out into the world. Are we happy for it to go out into the world with our name on it? You know, are we doing the best we can? You, I think, want to provide follow-on days. This is something Helen and I do for our master's and doctoral researchers, where once they've done the dissertation, we encourage and guide and support and nag them to publish that work through papers and conferences. And the point at which we started to do that, we saw a real increase in the numbers of publications that were happening. So the good intentions are not enough. They're not enough for anybody. They're certainly not enough for people who are working full-time in professional clinical practice or professional educational practice and publishing as well. And you want to provide, the institution should provide dedicated time and the very small amount of money that they require for writing development activities. If there's a little more than a very small amount, you could actually fund an academic writing development lead to be a champion for writing, to support research writing and publishing for individuals, and develop a culture of research writing and publishing. This is what Trudy did in Lyme. And it is, relative to the budgets for the undergraduate medical programme, it's tiny. It's £3,000 a year up front, and it's the equivalent of 1 day a week of a salary for was a grade 8, now grade 9 person. So it's less than £25,000. And what that person did is go and talk individually to people, collect resources, network people into writing development and research writing support elsewhere, read drafts, talk through ideas, bring people together to talk through ideas and read drafts, bring people together to work on writing abstracts, writing submissions. Small steps that have brought people into that sense of entitlement to consider them research writers and has seen our publishing rates go up. The people who always publish. They just get on and do it. That happens wherever. But the people who are tentative, or the people who are publishing a little bit, recovering from that experience and doing it again, are doing it faster, quicker, more broadly. And we record and we acknowledge and we celebrate the successes, small and large. And that is what I suggest the institution could do. The institution needs to invest in the people who are investing in themselves. So, Salamat Maju, good luck with that. These are our addresses if you want to. I suspect some people will be immediately contacting me saying, yes, I wish to collaborate with a native English speaker. That would be fine. And then there are a lot of reading and resources there. And I think we got in and started a little bit late, so we may have a little bit of time for questions. So, do we have any questions?
So I was just at the AD conference,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the things, there was a very interesting symposium session about publications in medical education. So this group did a study together with Lambert, Massachusetts, and the whole from Portugal and a few other countries. They found that actually about 80% of the publications in medical education comes from less than 10 countries. So about 6 or 7 countries in the world. Right? So if you understand, so 80%, this is looking from published data, 80% of the literature in medical education in English comes from very handful of countries.
And would those countries be North America, Canada, Australia, Holland, UK, Netherlands, yeah.
And they say this is very alarming because, sure, in English publications, you expect more English-speaking countries, but it's so not representative of what you would see in a biomedical context or medicine or pharmacy, where maybe 50% or something comes from these countries. The fact that 80% comes, they are also challenging the role of these journals at the moment. Journals and how they see. So one example, if you take academic medicine, hardly from at least 7-8 countries, it drops down to majority only of 3 or 4 countries. So academic medicine, it seems, does have a trend of taking papers generally from North America.
Yeah.
It seems. This is just from published data. Now, given that I ask myself why is this, right? Truly, if you look at the scope of the journal and the areas that they're talking about, there should be some interest. So is it that, as you said, some of the pitfalls, there must be in these other things that the papers are not coming up, must have some pitfalls? Or is there the fact that the peer reviewers or something that is not of interest from other parts of the world for it to be there? So I sometimes am afraid that because of this, there are journals now that are coming up within the region. So they have TACS, the Asia Pacific Scholar, you have the Japanese Education Journal, Korean Medical Education Journal, and everything, whether this is the way, or because then it will isolate. It's not coming to the main aim of publication, where you want to share and engage. And given that about maybe 70-80% of doctors are expatriate from the parts of the world that are not publishing. So I just raised this question for us to think about also, that while there is some pitfalls, the journals also have to rethink
Absolutely.
some of their ways that they do.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that's why I was sort of urging people to try and get the peer review. But I think what this reminds me of is, it is a dilemma. Do you go for, do you keep trying to kind of get into the stronghold, or do you put your energies into the region? And I think it's like any political, and I think it is a political issue, that Eurocentric, North American-centric thing, that you have to do both. You have to have double vision. So you have to have ways of challenging the dominant people, but you also have to grow your own. Because if you don't do that, you're not, and growing your own is kind of like one of the ways you will build the confidence to get people in. And I think that symposium sounds really interesting, and it fits with the work that Teresa Lidis has done a lot of research into publishing. But it makes me think that it might be worthwhile thinking about formulating a developmental project, because there have been developmental projects in certain other discipline areas where specific journals have attachments and their processes are looked at, and they work with their reviewers, and they're kind of training the reviewers to be more culturally sensitive in a way, as well as training the researchers to be more savvy about how to kind of play the game to get in. That sounds like something to think about.
Another angle just for me for consideration is, while because we of our academic background, we are thinking about publishing academic papers. Now, the e-learning team is not here, but I know with the e-learning team, when I talk to them about, hey guys, you are doing so many things, come, let's get it published in some journal or something. For them, I say, why not? We can go to this blog, or we can use this particular website, and for them, the peer review is, when you publish, how many people are going to read and make an impact? But if you go to where for them, this kind of open access,
Yeah.
they do you publish and then you get peer review.
Yeah.
So that kind of concept for my e-learning team, so I was thinking to myself, so is this still relevant or not, these journals, the relevance of sending to journals? So whether your scholarly work, but I think at the end of the day, if your aim is to share, then it needs to be trusted, right? You need to trust that work and that source. It's not just claiming anything. So that's why the journal or any of these other portals need to ensure some kind of
it is. There's a dialectic. There's a kind of dialectic going on there, because one of the questions I ask in a smaller workshop setting is, okay, you're all desperate to get into these journals. Are you reading them? How much journal reading do you do? And I think because of the performance-driven nature, it's sometimes about tick, 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 I've got it published, I've got it published. Thinking about actual impact and how influential, how it's read, how often you read, there's a bit of a tension there. And I think open access, you're right, we're at a sort of pivot point, because the journal thing has just expanded, and history teaches us that it will probably fall over. It will get too big, it will get too unwieldy. And I think we're seeing some of that with all the arguments about the kind of money, the funding of it as an industry.
the funding and the it's free peer review service they get from us.
Yeah.
But the publishing companies are making
millions. Yeah. So it's an interesting and complex issue. So I look forward to seeing that symposium written up somewhere.
I'm so happy to see many IB colleagues here. The aim is we want to support both. Support the individual and also the institution. Because one of the things we perceive, and I think it's somewhat true, at least in the region, we are quite well known for how we differently do things in terms of education. And it's about sharing our stories in a scholarly manner, and it's beneficial should be at the individual level and the institutional. So that's why we organize these sort of sessions to encourage. But I like what you said about cycle and getting in part and parcel. And I must say, even when I had a break with writing, it was very difficult to get into the cycle. But once you do it more and more, and I love your idea about being a peer reviewer. Because I peer review and I'm on the editorial board sometimes, I actually see a different perspective and I learn from that.
Yeah.
So maybe we already are putting some initiatives in ICE to try to get this rolling. We'll do more, and we'll need all your support and how we can support each other, and we will share our stories and get the recognition that I think we deserve actually, because our story is quite unique.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay. Yes, sorry, we have a question.
If there are, because in biomedical science research, there are a lot of predatory journals. Are there any predatory journals in medical education?
Yes, this is interesting. One of the things I've learnt on my trip here is A, be very careful crossing the road in Malaysia, and B, the concept of the predator journal. Because in our context, in the UK, we do get from time to time emails offering us the opportunity to publish, and often they go straight to our spam, they're filtered out by the system, or you look at them and you think, this doesn't look very professional, this isn't a journal I've ever heard of, I don't recognise this name, bin it. And particularly if people are sending on a discipline that is nothing to do with anything I've ever done myself. I think, well, you've got my name from somewhere, but actually I don't think you're for real. So we're not that familiar with predator journals, but talking to colleagues here this week, it's a big issue. It comes up as a big issue for them. And I would imagine there are. It seems to me that, I don't know, but I would think there are predator journals in all the disciplines. Is that the case, or is it?
Yeah, there would be in all disciplines, and you've got to make that judgment, huh? And that's why the fact that it needs to be, there's RSI index and so on and so forth, there's certain criteria. Actually, that goes to the familiarity of, I like what you said again, how often do we read journals in our area? Then if you know which is cited most, what
Yeah.
you make the most impact.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to go for medical teacher, medical education. So there's something called perspective in medical education. That probably the Dutch
Yeah.
medical education paper, education in health. There are a few other journals, and now the Asia Pacific Scholar is coming. USM has a paper journal also that is, I know, very well managed by the USM team. So it's for us to start reading those papers also and see.
That's right. If you read the journal, I think you would pick up quite quickly, because some of those predator journals, like we used to have for creative writers something called Vanity Publishing in the UK, and if you try to find those publications, you never find them. They never get published. But if you go along the lines of setting up a kind of support mechanism for peer reviewing stuff before it goes out, part of that discussion would be where are you sending it and why are you sending it there, and that would pick up, I think, you develop some kind of crowd knowledge about avoid this is good for the other.